Unit 7, Chapter 14, Greeks and Non-Greeks, Erich Gruen. Whatever else Greeks were, they were not barbarians, at least not by their own lights. After all, they spoke Greek. Others spoke in unintelligible tongues, thus sounding to Greek ears as so much bar bar bar. The term barbarian served to demarcate the Hellenic world from the non-Hellenic. It provided a useful device to establish the distinctiveness of Greek values and character. When the term first came into fashion remains obscure. Its usage was rare indeed prior to the 5th century BCE, when the invasion of Persia galvanized the Greeks to develop a sharper sense of their own collective identity. The initial connotation of barbarian may have been quite neutral and innocent, nothing more than gobbledygook speaker. But in the 5th and 4th centuries, it began to carry a lot of extra baggage. It might suggest cultural or intellectual inferiority, lack of refinement, various insensibilities, brutality, chicanery, and a tendency to embrace despotism rather than the rule of law. It was certainly better to be a Greek than a barbarian. A famous saying, ascribed both to Thales and to Socrates, gave thanks to the gods for three things: that I was born human, not an animal, a man, not a woman, and a Greek, not a barbarian. Whether either of these philosophers made such a statement, we cannot know. But the ascription appears in a Hellenistic text by the biographer Hermippos of Smyrna in the 3rd century BCE, and it earned an echo in rabbinic writings with, of course, a Jewish twist. A prayer of thanks to the Lord, who did not make me a slave, did not make me a woman, and did not make me a goy. Climate alone produced essential differences between Europeans and Asians. Some Greeks, at least, had convinced themselves of the fact. That notion appears in a late 5th century treatise, Airs, Waters, Places, attributed to Hippocrates. The uniformity of their seasons renders Asians soft and unwarlike, idle and prone to accept rule by despots. Violent changes of climate make Europeans tougher, braver, self-reliant, and less inclined to submit to monarchs. This idea gained sharper definition in Aristotle's Politics. He specifies the Greeks in particular as beneficiaries of the ideal geographical and climatic conditions. Other Europeans endure cold climates and may be hardy and tough, but they are stupid and incapable of governing themselves, let alone anyone else. Asians enjoy the warm weather and possess some intelligence, but they are enervated and lazy, readily enslaved by their rulers. Greeks hold the middle ground, both intelligent and spirited, thus a free people capable of governing all mankind. Aristotle indeed may have practiced what he preached. A report has it that he advised his pupil Alexander the Great to be a leader for the Greeks, but a master for the barbarians. Treat the former as friends and kinsmen, the latter as animals or plants. Alexander did not take the advice. Climate, nature, and ethnicity were not necessarily determinative. Socrates famously asserted that the name Greeks refers not to a race, but to a mindset, and that the designation belongs to those who share our culture rather than our nature. This implies that the Hellenic achievement was open to non-Greeks, but also that few would earn it. Socrates, writing in support of a pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia, kept the distinction sharp. The dichotomy, however, is much fuzzier than such statements, so often quoted, might suggest. One needs only to read Herodotus. To be sure, the word barbaros, or a form thereof, appears with great frequency in his text, but the vast majority of instances occur in the second half of his history, when he treats the Persian War and the contrast between combatants in critical ways. And this polarity barely, if at all, affects his ethnography. As is well, Herodotus shows an even-handedness, indeed occasionally great admiration for the traits, character, and accomplishments of non-Greek peoples, notably Egyptians, Persians, and Phoenicians, even Scythians, so much so that Plutarch later went so far as to label him a Philobarbaros. Of course, Plutarch here buys into the standard dichotomy. Herodotus, in fact, had a much more subtle and complex take on the interplay of Greeks and non-Greeks. Plato also questioned the simplistic division of Greeks and barbarians, pointing out the multitudinous differences among the latter. Greeks, as is clear, spoke with many voices. Even the great enemy of Hellas, the Persian regime, its ruler and its people, was viewed through diverse lenses. Xenophon wrote an encomiastic biography of Cyrus the Great, imaginary and fictitious, but all the more telling for that. The Persian monarch was selected as the image of the ideal ruler, and the Persian Empire as exemplary of admirable rule. For most Greeks, like Socrates, Persia had become identified with luxury, servility, and decadence, an inviting target for attack. But Heraclides Ponticus, a pupil of Plato, writing on the eve of the Hellenistic age, pronounced the Persians and Medes as the noblest and bravest of barbarians. The enjoyment of pleasure is the mark of a liberal spirit. Alexander the Great had a mandate for the conquest of the Persian Empire, but, as is well known, the conqueror displayed a growing affinity for the institutions, practices, and values of the conquered. That may have irritated some of his Macedonian officers and troubled a few of his Greek advisors, but it was not wholly out of tune with Hellenic attitudes. The Alexandrian polymath Eratosthenes in the 3rd century heaped praise on the king for that broad-minded attitude and for rejecting the crabbed advice of Aristotle. Eratosthenes took direct aim at those who would divide the world into Greeks and barbarians. If a division is to be made, men must be judged for their virtues and vices. There are plenty of admirable barbarians. Take Indians and Aryans, even Romans and Carthaginians, and plenty of bad Greeks. The polyphonic chorus predominates. How to interpret it? The idea that the Hellenistic age brought with it a wider tolerance for the outsider does not supply a satisfactory answer. As we have seen, diverse attitudes can be found, and